My name is Jan Ove Tuv. I was a student about Nerdrums from 1996 to 2002, and this is the title of my lecture. As I believe I mentioned earlier, this is the dilemma. A figurative painter writes Arthur Danto and says, "Why am I so criticized? I just try to paint like Rembrandt." To which Dante replies, "Oh, you can paint like Rembrandt, but you have to do it with irony, which means you cannot paint like Rembrandt." The question then is passion outdated if expressed in an old master style? I believe that the new understanding of kitsch is an answer to that dilemma. Kitsch, which by Odd Nerdrum has been defined as passion's form of expression at all levels, with the task of creating a seriousness in life, at its best to be so sublime that it brings laughter to silence. And therefore he defines skill in craft as an important criterion for defining or viewing a work of kitsch. Now, this was from his opening speech of his retrospective show in 1998 in Oslo. And the reactions can more or less be divided into two categories. The first one is that this was some kind of a media stunt. And the second, that this was a pure question of semantics. And that Nerdrum was trying to say that kitsch really is the true art. The aim of my lecture is to show that this was not a media stunt, but the logical conclusion of 3 decades of criticism of Odd Nerdrum. And I will do that by way of comparing what has been said and written about kitsch in kitsch theory and what has been written about Odd Nerdrum. I will try to show that it's not a question of semantics, of trying to make the kitsch into the true art, but rather that modern or contemporary art is the true art. Now, the kitsch term has always been derogatory, and I think that's what confuses people a lot, because they're always thinking that it's something negative. And as such, it's a good example of winners writing history. Therefore, it is important to note that the new understanding of kitsch is not a change of content, but of connotation, as its essential characteristics remain the same, save that they are viewed positive. It's also important to note that it's not a matter of the opposition between abstract and representational painting, but rather that of the passionate versus the disinterested expression. And I've heard quite a bit that people say that this is Nerdrum's term, or something for Nerdrum students, reserved for them only. I would say that any narrative or theatrical or sentimental or pathetic or whatever painter of a certain stature will be subjected to this type of criticism, as I mentioned earlier, with Andrew Wyeth being called the greatest living kitsch meister. The criticism of kitsch is then based on the fine art values as they were defined in the 18th century, which ostracized the Greco-Roman principles of making a living work which grips the viewer emotionally, to the point where it doesn't look like a painting, but that's life itself. And I will end my lecture with talking about the benefits of engaging with a new understanding of kitsch. Now, before we begin, I'll give a short explanation of the conventional understanding of kitsch. A German critic writing in the 1930s says that it was born in Munich ateliers in the 1850s as a slogan in the fight against the tastelessness of the previous generations. And it is unanimously defined as being unoriginal, as not following the times, as being sentimental, theatrical, pathetic, melodramatic, and displaying exaggerated passion. And most importantly, that it's never ironic. And this is why we need to differentiate the kitsch term from the idea of camp, which is a display of irony or indifference, where the artist is saying, I know this is bad, and thus I display my good taste, which is akin to the thrill of watching a line dancer pretending to fall into bad taste, or of watching an American action movie. You know it'll end well. When Odd Nerdrum had his retrospective show in 1998, I was a student and assisted in the hanging of the show. As an extra service to the audience, the museum had a stack of reviews, starting with Nerdrum's solo show, first solo show in 1967 at the age of 23, and ending in 98. And luckily I had these reviews Xeroxed, and going through them, I recognized the adjectives from conventional kitsch criticism. And I noted that these adjectives remained fairly constant throughout his career, the majority of them being negative. Some critics going so far as to portray Nerdrum as some kind of a subhuman, and one critic even likening him or saying that he was worse than Dracula, as Nerdrum is not of the trolls that burst at sunrise. Topping that by likening him to the worst of all things imaginable, capitalism. Now, the first common identifier is that of being sentimental. This is Embrace that he showed at the museum that Brandon was talking about in 2002, which led a critic to define him as a master of exaggeration. Now, turning to conventional kitsch criticism, I would compare this to the German kitsch theorist who defines kitsch, the essence of kitsch, as that there are no limits to exaggeration when it comes to emotions. Now, the irony is that going through the positive reviews, which by and large are the American ones, you find the same attributes there. An Art in America review from '94, I believe, talked about Nerdrum's operatic investigations of passion, birth, murder, and death. Let us then turn to the second signifier, that of being unoriginal. This is The Shadow from 70s. A review from, I think it was 1977, talked of Nerdrum's show, the paintings there, as being imitations that can readily be found in the magazines of any European museum. And adjectives like academic and salon-like slippery skin painting were proliferant. Turning to conventional kitsch criticism, I would compare this to Thomas Kolka, who defines the academic style as kitsch only if it's made after academic painting, quote, has been superseded and rendered irrelevant to the contemporary art scene or art world. Again, you find the same attributes in positive reviews. Hilton Kramer, I believe that was also in the 90s, talks about Odd Nerdrum's technique as highly accomplished and reminiscent of the old masters. The last identifier is that of not following the times. Already in a review of Nerdrum's debut show from '67, one critic noted the young painter's tendency of looking to the past and said that pastiche, being an original copy, was not far to seek. And in the 80s, a Swedish critic talked about the impossibility of turning the clock back, as he was implying that Nerdrum was trying to do. Now, again, you can find, or if you turn to conventional kitsch criticism, I would compare this to the German critic who defines kitsch as betraying the style and will of the times, which comes from Hegel. And again, you can find the same attribute in positive reviews, notably Richard Wine talking about Nerdrum's images as a region of eternal quests and confrontations that lies at the core of all human culture. And it should not be too difficult to notice the similarities with Thomas Kuhlke, who writes that the motifs of kitsch perhaps could be further analyzed in terms of Jungian archetypes. Consequently, my conclusion is that the critics have been calling Nerdrum kitsch all along by using other synonyms. There are others, like his technique being described as mechanical. He's being criticized for elevating his motifs, of displaying predigested emotion, of seducing the viewer by virtue of the vividness of the images. And that is why I say that the kitsch declaration is a logical conclusion of, at that time, 3 decades of Nerdrum criticism. Now, some years back, I was fortunate to meet Andrew Wyeth together with Odd Nerdrum. And looking at reviews of Andrew Wyeth was a real déjà vu. His technique being described as formulaic, that it was caught in old master trappings, that he was sentimental, that he made magazine illustrations, that he had this nostalgia for the American rural life, and not the least, that he was called the greatest living kitschmeister. Not a gypsy, but not too far away. Clearly, these are negative adjectives, but one shouldn't necessarily identify negativity with objectivity, even though that's quite common. And it's important to bear in mind that these reviews are negative because they are based on the fine art principles, which also constitutes the vantage point of the negative view of kitsch. Now, this necessitates turning our attention to what art is. Now, not what we feel it is, but 1, what it is historically, and 2, what its principles are. And it is anachronistic to talk about Rembrandt as an artist in 2 senses. First of all, because the fine art, the value system of fine art, is not an eternal phenomenon, but an invention of the 18th century. Second of all, because it implies following specific principles. A quick look at the history of the term art. We are told that the Greeks had a term for that, which was techne, which leads to our technique. Now, the problem with that is that techne means skill that can be learned and taught. It's a rational procedure. The Roman equivalent being ars. The Greeks did also not have any term of fine art or grouping of those arts, painting, sculpture, poetry, music, and architecture. So any translation of artist or fine art into ancient Greek becomes impossible. Go to the Middle Ages, painting and sculpture were grouped among the mechanical arts and got quite low ranking among other arts like cooking, navigation, and juggling. And painters were grouped together with drugghists because that's where they got their pigments. You go to the Renaissance, there was still no category of fine art, even though that's when they start seeking liberal arts status. And Vasari never uses the word artist, but artisan, craftsman. In the Baroque 17th century, the word artists would refer to a student of the liberal arts, theoretical arts, like rhetoric, geometry, and music theory. And in the 17th century, you start getting the clarification. You get the separation between sciences, humanities, which also makes it possible to have a concept of fine art. But actually, fine art in the way we could identify with is only seen as late as first time seen in 1746 by a Frenchman. Consequently, there were several books written on this new phenomenon, and it's interesting to note that the young Goethe, the German poet, wrote a review on this and ridiculing that all these arts were grouped together in this book without them having anything to do with each other. And with such a philosophy, you could group anything together and suggest that they were connected. Now, by the 1830s, the value system of fine art was established, and you dropped the prefix fine and you just said art. And this is what makes it a bit confusing, because you can see the word art in 15th century texts, but that's the neutral term, not fine art term. So in the 1830s, art is transformed from being a neutral term for discipline or knowledge, and is transformed into the essence of mankind and the savior of humanity. Obviously, it is a challenge to define the principles of something which does not exist. With the 18th century, however, that all changed. And I'd like to look at the three most important principles of the fine art system. And I will talk about, firstly, the behavior of the audience. Secondly, the behavior or the quality of the artist. And lastly, the goal of art as such. The first principle then is that of aesthetical indifference, which is a term that Kant used a lot. Or it can be described as disinterestedness. Now, what was excluded then was the sensual bodily desires or sentimental emotions, became unacceptable as reasons for liking an image, a painting. This is obviously a strong contrast to Leonardo and the Greco-Roman principle of vividness. Leonardo then painting, not this one, but another painting of the Madonna, where the customer asked him to paint over the religious attributes because he felt that he was being blasphemous as he desired to sleep with this woman. And in the end, he couldn't take it anymore and sent the picture away from his house. Now, this is the same kind of effect that Kant defines as barbarism, and which is not allowed, and which Greenberg then ridicules because the viewer is so overwhelmed by how it's so living and it's so real that it's miraculous. Turning to the second principle, we encounter that of being original. What happens here also is that there becomes a separation between fine art and craft, and that's why it's a commonplace today to talk about, it's more than mere craft. Mere is a Kant word. And Kant talks about art as being the act of genius, which something he defines as the opposite of learning or imitation. So genius is based on originality, inspiration, freedom, and creative expression, whereas craft is left with the mechanical signifiers such as obeying tradition, basing yourself on skill, and following rules. Incidentally, the Greeks had a name for painters and sculptors, and that was banausos, which means mechanic. So that's quite right. Now, this is obviously a strong contrast with the Greco-Roman principles of emulating or copying past masters. This is Luca Giordano, 17th century, who was hailed for being able to imitate the style of past masters. So because of this idea of originality, Van Gogh then conceives knowledge as a corruption of his personal style, and he only has 8 months of training in an academic training. The last principle is that of following the time, which was advocated by Hegel especially. Now, this is essentially a package deal, and underlying this principle is a belief in societal progress, that the artist has a political or moral responsibility in contributing to society. And Hegel plainly says that this is no longer the time for masterpieces because the state is taking care of morals, so you can contribute with a little brick into the wall of society. It also implies the belief that different times or cultures cannot be reenacted. So you sort of shut the door to the past and you have to move on. This is also the reason why Danto says to that painter that you can be like Rembrandt, but only you have to do it with irony. This is obviously a strong contrast with Michelangelo, and the Greek-Roman principles of timeless standards, where Michelangelo sought all of his life to recreate this figure, the Belvederian torso. What we may learn from this is that fine art is a new value system of the 18th century. It constitutes an ideological break with that of the Greek or Roman culture or old master culture. It took about 80 years from its inception to its implementation, and Rembrandt is not the archetypical old master, is not an artist, or kitsch for that matter, because the terms didn't exist at the time, so to be historically correct, you can say neither nor. Rembrandt was simply called a Schildermeister, a master of depiction. And the change that occurred is this. The Greco-Roman principle of pathos was replaced by that of disinterest in fine art, which led to the Greco-Roman principle being stigmatized as exaggeration and delegated to kitsch. The Greco-Roman principle of learning from past masters, not acknowledging these doors shut, was replaced by that of originality in fine art, which led to the Greco-Roman principle being stigmatized as copying and delegated to kitsch. The Greco-Roman principle of archetypes, using archetypical bodily postures or motifs, was replaced by that of following the times in fine art, which led to the Greco-Roman principle being stigmatized as old-fashioned and delegated to kitsch. So in short, what was expelled from the fine art system was kitsch. It is my contention that representational painting will not constitute a renaissance as long as it adheres to the fine art principles. One may agree with the new understanding of kitsch or not. The dilemma still remains that you can paint like Rembrandt today as long as you do it with irony, which means you cannot paint like Rembrandt today. And I hold the solution, the new understanding of kitsch, to be the solution to this dilemma. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, I had heard some rumors that this will not appeal to all representational painters. I don't know where that comes from. And not everybody needs it, most obviously. And then you will find out for yourselves. So who am I talking about? I think primarily at least two categories. I'm talking about those who do not identify with the fine art principles, but still have not found an alternative or some name for what they're doing. And I am also talking about those who are adhering to fine art, the fine art value system, with principles antithetical to their basic desires by default. And I'm sure there are other categories that I'm not mentioning. So, adhering to the Greco-Roman principles, but being subjected to fine art criticism obviously constitutes a problem. And the major problem is that this will often lead to what you could call a spine reaction. I mentioned it earlier, where your back goes straight immediately because you understand, I shouldn't do this. I will use an example from my own life. I had just started my apprenticeship with Odd Nerdrum, and I was struggling with a self-portrait. And I was trying out different solutions. And then I saw St. John the Baptist by Leonardo, where he's pointing to the heavens. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's the solution. I'll do that, because that gives my painting a narrative. And immediately, my spine reaction was, I can't do this. This is not allowed. And I was walking around fearing the eternal fire of hell for some days, and then I mentioned this to Odd Nerdrum. I said, well, can I do that? And he looked at me quite puzzled, and he said, well, yeah, you just have to make it better than Leonardo. Right, that solves the problem. Now, the thing is that I'll use another example of this self-doubt that comes in. If you're not completely aware of where you are standing, because fine art principles are already here about, so obviously everybody thinks that they're making fine art, or tries to. If you then are trying to make, let's say you're emulating Andrew Wyeth, because that's the most wonderful thing you know the reactions. And I've known it too, of course, having meeting this condescending looks, because I've been a student of Nerdrum, and that's very cute, and you'll grow up. So that can get to your bones, to the stomach. And you start doubting yourself. Yeah, I mean, everybody else is doing that. And worst case scenario, you start admitting that you were wrong. And you start complying with those values. Like this painter who told me himself that he had painted a portrait when he was going to his university art course. And there again was the spine reaction. This is too sentimental. Now what did he do? He painted white stripes over it. This is a common artification strategy. You paint white stripes over it, so it's a painting. It's not a living image anymore, it's an object. And this is what you could call artification. And if you are abiding by principles like that, if you are doing work like that, then there will be no new renaissance for representational painting, because the values of fine art are antithetical to those of the Renaissance. And I presume we're talking about Renaissance seriously, not just as name dropping, and that we do this because someone in the family had a painting at home once. What I see as the most important thing about the new understanding of kitsch is that it relieves you of this perhaps unconscious shame. If you are told, or you studied this yourself, I presume that, and you get to know that you really are adhering to a different value system than that of fine art, and you understand that it's not a crime to be affected by old masters. It's not a crime to be sentimental, you just have to be sentimental enough. And it's not a crime to not reflect your time. Then all of that shame or guilt is released into your work instead. And an extra bonus, guess what? Going into this, you start understanding also what fine art is. And you don't have to, that's like the second half of your energy waste. You don't have to spend energy on being bitter about all of these names. And why are we making PR for all of those people? Constantly mentioning those names. And you can stop that. Don't be a PR agent for I'm not going to mention the names. Don't hate art, because that is art. And you channel that, all that energy that is caught up in that, into your own work. Looking at Rembrandt, what did he really do? Not like, oh, is somebody looking at me doing this? And that's why I'm saying that the new understanding of kitsch may build or help you to build a greater self-confidence, because it works like a key or a mental floss in clarifying your values. And I think even though they are kitsch or fine art, it's an alternative. It's a new way of looking at things. And it's not about winning over art or something. It's about having a new category which should also be allowed. I mentioned this earlier, that Odd Nerdrum was asked, okay, so everything's easier with kitsch then, you get away from criticism. And quite the contrary, it becomes much more difficult, because you cannot just say that you're sentimental, you have to be sentimental. And you cannot just try to say that you're influenced by Rembrandt, you will be measured up against him. And the critics then will not just reject your work as old-fashioned, but really start looking at it. And also the bonus for critics is that if they like your work, they don't have to excuse you by appealing to fine art principles. Speaking of Andrew Wyeth, I don't remember which book, the author was talking about that, oh no, Andrew Wyeth is not old-fashioned. In fact, when he starts his watercolors, they look like abstract expressionism. So he needed to defend Wyeth on a completely different set of values. And to end, here's the example of what can happen with kitsch, about the figurative sculptor. who had his retrospective show in 2002, where the critic said that his work is really quite sentimental. It's not at all original. But I've read the book on kitsch, and I understand that these things are allowed if you're doing kitsch. And I'll try to judge his work accordingly. And for the first time in his life, he got a fair review, because the critic could then put on some kitsch gloves, so didn't get his hands dirty. And he could say, I'm using the glasses of kitsch, looking at this, and finally he saw what it actually was. I think that's a good example to end with. Thank you.